Hello, everybody. So we welcome you today at the keynote by Choi, Director of Marketing at Wildlake, a strategic advisory group. And today's keynote will be devoted to the Great Reset, closing the gap on a wealthy disparity. And Sierra, could you join us with a brief introduction on yourself and your company and why you selected this topic to discuss today?
Hello, so thank you, Nadia, for inviting me to this talk. I'm Choi. I'm originally from Silicon Valley and now based in South Korea. And I started out my career as a digital producer, then moved to business development positions for the tech industry. I was also chair of educational and industry events for the Producers Guild of America, and also am the director of marketing for the Wildlake Strategic Advisory Group. I've also founded an e-commerce company based on health and wellness. And my primary areas of interest are in biotech, genetics, neuroscience, e-commerce, and ed tech. And in my spare time, I can be found reading obscure medical research, various trivia about figures in history, and I also like walking my dogs and running 4K every day, in addition to experimenting with new culinary recipes. And I also advise startups as well. And I chose this topic because I think it is quite relevant to our era today, with the tremendous amount of change that we're going through.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sierra, for such an in-depth introduction. And could you maybe share some slides with us and go on with your keynote, and we'll follow up with a Q&A session from our audiences, which are serial entrepreneurs and VC investors. And so please share with us your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. So let me begin. So the topic of my keynote is the Great Reset, closing the gap on wealth disparity. And I want to begin with a quote from Steve Jobs. Innovation is the ability to see change as an opportunity, not a threat. And we are currently experiencing times of economic uncertainty. And as we are going through the COVID-19 crisis in what IMF chief economist Gita Gopinath called the Great Lockdown, which he compares to the Great Depression of the 1930s era, I think through this uncertainty, this time of tremendous change, that this could represent new opportunities that didn't exist before. So in society, the people who can usually predict the future always tend to be artists, writers, and philosophers. If we examine writers such as George Orwell's 1984, Soren Kierkegaard's Hypervigilant Society, Deleuze's Capitalism and Schizophrenia, and even Joseph Beuys' Social Sculptures, these writers, and David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest, these writers and artists were able to not only visualize a future, but to predict it exactly as it is now. So in history, we learn what is past is prologue, which is essentially whoever doesn't know history is bound to repeat it. So we must understand the past in order to understand not only the future, but also the present era. And currently we are going through rapid change that is altering the global economy. In the past, as a collective society, we have experienced feudalism, communism, socialism, capitalism, and various different types of economies. And in each social structure, there is a time limit of when internal factions, and what I mean by internal factions are groups within the government engaged in the struggle for power. And these factions would break down the government and transform into an oligarchy. So whatever form of economic system we have today, whatever labels we put on it, it usually ends up all eventually transforming into a type of oligarchy. And this was evident in ancient Rome between just a few examples here, there are several examples, but I will just go through a few, between Julius Caesar and the Senate, in which Rome eventually became a stifling, unstable oligarchy that would lead to its downfall, eventually beginning with Emperor Augustus. And also in 1700s Russia, where there had been a power struggle between Tsar Peter III and the Senate, which would eventually lay the groundwork for the Bolshevik Revolution 150 years later. in 1960s United States when President John F. Kennedy went against the Senate to launch his executive orders regarding monetary policy. And in the UK, when King Edward VIII abdicated due to the reason of wanting to marry an American divorcee. But in reality, it was well known that Edward VIII did not get on with the Prime Minister nor the House of Commons during World War II. So we see this sort of thing time and time again when certain factions take a hold of the government and there is an internal power struggle. What usually happens is that the emperor, president, king are usually deposed and the Senate or House of Commons takes control of the government and the government eventually becomes a type of oligarchy. Currently, we are living in an era of corporatism in which the corporation has the most power over governance in the global economy. In previous eras, especially during the Middle Ages, the church was the most dominant financial institution that controlled the economy. We typically consider churches now as part of a religion, but as an institution, they were more of a type of financial institution married with the government. And that was particularly true in England and the rest of Europe when the financial center used to be in Italy during the time of the Medicis, who not only ran financial institutions, but also placed many of their members as popes to rule over their nation. So in the present era, since the 1800s and onwards, the corporation has taken the position of the church as the most dominant institution that controls the economy. And we see quite a bit of overlap between members of corporations who also work for the government in making policy. And in America, we see many examples of the overlap between the private and public sectors, such as Dick Cheney, members of Google and Coinbase, etc. So one of the problems we have today is that we determine a nation's wealth through its GDP, its gross domestic product. But GDP does not determine the quality of life in that particular nation. And if we examine a nation like Switzerland, which is not at all in the top 10 GDP of the global economy, I think one would say that the majority of their citizens live quite well compared to other nations, such as India, in which they have a higher GDP but still suffer from widespread poverty. So in my assessment, GDP is an outdated way to assess a nation's overall wealth, standard of living, access to resources and services, and overall well-being of its citizens. So the problem is how to close the gap on wealth disparity, or how to close the gap between the poor and the rich. And in the United States, the gap is tremendous. I'll show you a graph here on the right. And the wealth disparity in the United States has exponentially grown just within 50 years. So we have 10%, or probably less than 10% of the population holding nearly 80% of the overall share of wealth. And the rest of the population falls below, well below the median baseline. And this wealth gap has been exponentially increasing, not only in the United States, but also in other nations in Europe, including Germany and the United Kingdom. So the question is, how do we close this gap on wealth disparity? And I think the solution is surprisingly quite simple. But before I go into the solution, let me give you a few examples. So during the pandemic, in a city called Tenino in Washington State in the United States, the local government decided to print their own money made of wood to be solely used in their city. So essentially, the local government issued money in the form of wood. That was their special unique currency to be utilized for local purchases only. And as a result, their local population was able to sustain itself during the lockdown. And during World War II, Switzerland, an organization called the Swiss Economic Circle, now called WEIR, which means we in German, decided to create a collective of local businesses and barter trade amongst themselves. And they were able to sustain themselves during a time of great economic crises, different from many other cities and nations. But what they did was build a collective based on trust between businesses and barter traded what they needed between each other. And for the people who don't know what barter trade is, it's a system in which a person or group or business trade goods and services for goods and services, bypassing the use of money. For example, if a business has a surplus of X amount of goods, they can trade with another company that needs those goods from some other services that they might need. So they're usually using the pure asset, which are the goods and services itself. And my last example is in South Korea, in the city where I am currently. The local government decided to issue gift certificates, which can be used in the same way as currency to make purchases within the local city. So it is quite similar to what Tenino in Washington State did. So South Korea and Tenino found similar sorts of solutions, different from Switzerland, but both these solutions were able to keep investments, the investment in the local government makes within the community and benefits the local population directly. And it was also able to shield people from a lack of access to currency. So when a local government keeps money circulating within its own vicinity, it shields the population from the effects of potential hyperinflation, and it keeps businesses afloat during economic crises. So here is a very interesting quote from the CEO and one of the founders of Twitter, Jack Dorsey. And he said recently, the world ultimately will have a single currency. The internet will have a single currency, and it will be Bitcoin. And this is sort of a very controversial quote, and I'll explain why. So one of the problematic features of a one world currency is that it actually increases wealth disparity. It creates a climate in which the few become tremendously wealthy and the rest become poor. If we think about the euro, which was launched in 1999, it was an experiment originally conceived in order to facilitate trade between the nations in the European Union. However, what ended up happening was that the euro and its fiscal policy across all the nations in the EU created a larger gap between the rich and the poor. And as a result, nations such as Greece, Spain, Italy, and Portugal suffered. And this is primarily because a single fiscal policy across many different nations becomes entirely ineffective simply because individual nations cannot set monetary policy to best affect the recovery. And if we view nations in the EU before they adopted the euro, we can clearly see that those nations were much better off using their own currency and making their own fiscal policies. Now, this doesn't mean that the European Union is not successful in many other respects. And the ideology of the EU was originally intended to prevent world wars, as we saw in World War I and World War II. However, I think after the 2008 financial crisis, we saw many of the pitfalls of a single currency being utilized across multiple European nations, and that it will probably benefit European citizens more if they went back to adopting their own national currencies. So in summary, a one world, one government, one currency solution actually leads to wealth inequality. Whereas when local governments take it upon themselves to issue their own fiscal policies and launch their own currencies, then we avoid many of the pitfalls of economic instability. So now we're at a very interesting junction in the evolution of the US dollar. Since the Bretton Woods Agreement after World War II, the US dollar has had its position as the reserve currency of the world. However, in 2016, the IMF approved 4 other reserve currencies: the euro, the British sterling, the Japanese yen, and the Chinese yuan. Now, if China and Japan, who are the largest holders of US debt, decide to dump the US dollar, it would trigger a collapse. Within the last decade, China has made bilateral agreements with Japan, Russia, and Saudi Arabia to utilize their own currency in trade instead of the US dollar. So the US dollar is currently in a precarious position in which it could potentially be replaced as a major reserve currency. So what that means for businesses is that if there is a dollar collapse, then the dollar would lose its value to nearly zero, and all businesses in the United States and those connected to the United States would henceforth all collapse as well, making it the flash sales of the century for foreign investors. Currently, many investors are using gold and Bitcoin to hedge the dollar, but it was recently reported that 66% of Bitcoin's hash rate and computer power was being located in China. And this could be particularly problematic for institutional investors, and they could be prone to a 51% attack that could wipe out the entire wealth of American and European investors who are actively invested in Bitcoin. So the question is then, how do we close the gap on wealth disparity and also prevent a collapse of the dollar, which would entail the collapse of businesses? So in the worst case scenario, and I'm not saying that this would happen, but in the worst case scenario, if Bitcoin became the single one world currency and the US dollar also collapsed, then we would experience exponential hyperinflation. And this would not only affect the United States, but it will also affect China, the EU, and many other nations as well as a consequence. And this will be because the set criteria for hyperinflation will be met. One nation potentially manipulating the value of Bitcoin. And in addition, blockchains are not immutable, as popularly believed, and information within blocks could be altered either with a 51% attack or more sophisticated attacks in which organizations with unlimited resources could alter cryptocurrency transactions. So when Bitcoins, and also when Bitcoins are also eventually all mined, the control of transaction fees will eventually skyrocket, replacing current banks with similar financial entities that are able to control the limited distribution of Bitcoins. And paradoxically, unlimited Bitcoins could also be issued in the future due to the unlimited number of blockchains that could be built on top of existing blockchains, further driving down the value of existing BTC. So in the early 2000s, we saw the launch of many companies offering second layer solutions, and they have become rather commonplace. And in the next 10, 15 years, third and fourth layer solutions could further cloud transparency, and eventually Bitcoin transactions will not be any different from a typical financial transaction with multiple hidden fees, transactional fees, and other data that the user might not be able to immediately perceive. And that is somewhat already happening with second and third layer solutions. So in effect, in order to close the gap on wealth disparity, it is absolutely necessary to avoid a single one world currency, whether that is a cryptocurrency like BTC or a fiat currency. So now I want to give a little bit of a historical background into the use of continental currencies during the US Revolutionary War with cryptocurrencies. There are quite a few similarities between continental currencies that mirrors our current situation with cryptocurrencies. So during the Revolutionary War in the 1700s between the US and the United Kingdom, the US issued continental currencies, which eventually lost its value significantly due to inflation, and notes became 1/40th of its value or less, so that they were eventually taken out of circulation. There were also a problem with British counterfeiters, but that's a bit of a side note. So this hyperinflation occurred because each state's Treasury Department were printing vast amounts of notes in order to pay for the war without any backing of currency with assets and without any reimbursement from the government for expenditures. And this inevitably led to a spiraling race to the bottom in value, and the continental currencies became worthless. So after the Revolutionary War, when continental currencies collapsed, the US implemented a gold and silver clause in the US Constitution so that individual states could not issue their own bills of credit, but instead only be allowed to use gold and silver coins in the payment of debts. Now, this changed completely during the Civil War when the US dollar became the sole currency of the United States and was moved to a gold standard in 1900. This essentially stabilized the notes issued by the government in the form of the dollar. And the reason why notes were backed by gold had a lot to do with the influence of the British economist Adam Smith, who over decades of observation of wealth distribution in the UK, wrote in his book, The Wealth of Nations, that the best standard of the use of money in Western nations were metals such as gold. Different commodities served to be utilized as a medium of exchange, but eventually Smith observed that the nations finally settled on metals because they were durable and divisible and transparent. However, after World War II, All other currencies were valued in terms of the US dollar through the Bretton Woods system, and therefore indirectly linked to gold. But the need for the US to maintain this pressure became quite complex, and President Richard Nixon stopped the gold standard, which eventually brings us to the current era in which inflation has affected the US dollar and hence exacerbating wealth disparity over a period of decades. In fact, a lot of the economic effects that we are experiencing today in regards to wealth disparity is directly linked to what happened in the 1970s and the removal of the gold standard. So now let's compare the Great Depression versus the Great Lockdown. During the Great Depression, every major currency abandoned the gold standard, including the Bank of England. And this was due to people hoarding vast amounts of gold in their private collection and depleting gold reserves. And also people simply did not trust banks at all. So in contemporary times, we have a very similar situation. We have already abandoned the gold standard through President Nixon. People are hoarding cash, or rather corporations are hoarding cash in offshore tax accounts. And there is a general public's distrust of banks, which has resurfaced in full force due to the financial crisis of 2008 and the Occupy Wall Street movement. And the distrust of banks have led to the rise of cryptocurrencies and the potential collapse of the US dollar. So as far as cryptocurrencies have also been revolutionary in the way that it has bypassed the Treasury Department and banks as a form of exchange. Now, the problem with cryptos and Bitcoin is that it suffers from the potential pitfalls of what the United States already experienced in the credit crunch of continental currencies during the Revolutionary War. There are obviously exceptions and asset-backed cryptos such as those backed by gold, and also the Petro, which is a physical reserve-backed crypto launched in Venezuela. But obviously the problem is that with certain stablecoins such as Tether, because it is tied to the value of the dollar, if the dollar collapses, so will Tether and many other cryptos as a consequence, since Tether is used to circumvent trading with banks. So despite that Bitcoin has become popular with retail investors and the average citizen, I think it has mainly become a tool for the 1% to preserve their wealth. And as you can see on the right of Bitcoin multimillionaires, the majority of these people were already multimillionaires to begin with. And another more significant problem, though, is that one nation has the power to significantly manipulate the value of Bitcoin. So we are seeing a cyclical event of a boom and bust cycle. And this is problematic in wealth distribution because then one nation is able to effectively control the price of Bitcoin. So now I want to discuss a resource-based economy. And what I mean by a resource-based economy is a system in which all goods and services are available without the use of any system of debt or servitude, like money, credit, or barters. In theory, all resources become the common heritage of all the people. And in a use case, essential services, housing, and goods would be available to all, and this system could complement and exist alongside a financial monetary system. So the critics of a resource-based economy are typically proponents of Henry Kissinger, who was the former Secretary of State during World War II. And typically people from the baby boomer generation have raised doubt about the viability of a resource-based economy, in that resources are ultimately limited and exponential population increase will create a lack of goods and perpetuate competition amongst the population. But we have to remember that many of these critics were products of World War II, in which their generation suffered from food shortages and other kinds of shortages. So the primary concerns were about controlling overpopulation as opposed to controlling an abundance of resources, which is what we have today. So in the next few slides, I'll just give a few examples. So more than 50% of unsold food at supermarkets in the US and the UK simply end up in the bin and in landfills. And this is because we have an abundance of food production at our disposal. And surprisingly, one of the most wasteful and toxic industries we have today is the fashion and textile industries. 21 billion tons of textile waste end up in landfills in the United States alone, due to unsold clothing from shops. And these clothes end up seeping toxic dyes into the ground and infiltrating the water supply. The UK is the 4th largest textile waste producer in Europe, and Italy is number 1. So we are producing too much that ultimately only ends up in landfills. And rivers across China, South Korea, India are ended up with toxic dyes produced from the fashion industries. And here is the Yangtze River in China. And the river is just overrun with toxic red dyes, which ultimately have a severe effect on our ecosystem. And there are also 18 million abandoned homes in the United States, lovely homes that have been abandoned simply because they don't sell on the market. And there are 11 million abandoned mansions and chateaus across Europe that are simply vacant and rotting away. So we have more than enough real estate in the world that could be utilized for good purpose, but we simply are doing nothing about it and letting these beautiful estates fall into ruin and disrepair. So in contemporary times, we actually live in an era of abundance, and the products that multinational corporations produce, or even the food we produce daily, typically end up in landfills. And this is creating great environmental harm. So it's not that we don't have enough food or enough products or enough phones or computers or enough available real estate. It's just that they're not being repurposed or distributed in a way that benefits the overall population. So in summary, the short-term solution to closing the gap on wealth disparity would be implementing a system where there is a diverse pool of local currencies, which is maintained by each nation or state that preserves the wealth of its population and is backed by central banks or assets and actively addresses the needs of the local population and serves to lessen the effects of hyperinflation and also, of the negative aspects of deflation. And Switzerland could serve as a base use case of how each canton was able to prevent its population from experiencing the negative effects of deflation in 2015 and their use of the Swiss economic circle during economic crises. And the long-term solution would be to implement or partially implement a resource-based economy. And this would further a society in which instead of a few billionaires and the 1%, or rather the 0.001%, it would distribute resources in which everyone would become multimillionaires and poverty would simply cease to exist. Now, a society breaks down in stages. When first there is financial collapse, then commercial collapse follows, then political collapse, which is followed by social collapse and eventually cultural collapse, and chaos ensues. And we've already witnessed these entire stages in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia at the turn of the century, Arab Spring in Egypt and Yemen, and the Occupy Wall Street movements across the world. And it is when people lose faith in the central banking system that we are at the beginning of a prolonged financial collapse that eventually results in political and cultural collapse. So in the Great Reset, I think we will go through extraordinary changes that will change our global economy and hopefully close the gap on wealth disparity. I think production on demand. There will no longer be a necessity for physical shops to exist. And the COVID-19 crisis has become somewhat of an experiment to achieve those ends. When there are physical shops, we have a surplus of goods, and especially in sectors such as fashion or retail or supermarkets, we have seen that there is an exorbitant amount of waste in which more than 50% of the inventory goes directly into landfills. And that has created a wasteful society in which we have negatively affected the environment, which obviously has long-term consequences. Therefore, production on demand will have to become standard in our era so that most items will only be produced as an as-needed basis, whether it's for clothes, cars, bags, shoes, computers, phones, novelty items, and on and on. And what might become more prominent are pop-up shops that exist for a temporary period. Ultimately, this obviously will affect real estate as well, because there will no longer be a necessity for shops to have a physical presence. And it will also affect GDP because GDP will decrease exponentially. But the wealth of the people and the well-being of the people will increase, which is ultimately what is more important. I also think that work from home will become the norm. It's actually already somewhat of a norm now, although people believe it will be temporary. I think this is going to alter the way we work long term. There will no longer be a necessity to commute to work because work can be done anywhere in the world. And as AR, augmented reality solutions become more advanced and more widely adopted, I think holographic technologies will become commonplace so that people will be able to interface with coworkers and work with flexible schedules, and the 9-to-5 will become obsolete. Another interesting shift is happening around the world today in that social media has created the advent of the passion industry. And what I mean by the passion industry is when people work by doing something they love. It used to be that in the 1950s, at the turn of this, in the mid-centuries, during the height of the fourth industrial revolution, people went to university in order to find a good job and make 6 figures and buy a house. And that was part of the American dream, Asian dream, European dream. Nowadays, a high school student can learn how to play guitar, amass a following of 30,000 users on YouTube, and make 6 figures a year by producing a couple of videos a week. So that is something that has transpired from our early social media generation that was fueled by YouTube and Facebook and Google, that redirects advertising revenue to the creators who are working in their field of passion, whether that is music or art or gardening, cooking, or even remodeling 16th century French chateaus. Social media allows anyone with a camera and a computer to be able to utilize their particular talents or skills and interests and become profitable over time. And which then leads us to AI. Currently, we are in a transitional period in which AI is taking over many previous professions. During the Great Reset, I think AI will allow for people to live in abundance without having to do these sorts of jobs that were previously done by workers, so that people can focus on the passion industries. So what we will have is a society in which we will have a combination of essential workers and creative workers. So the redistribution of resources. In our generation, wealth has become determined largely by how many shares people hold in the stock market, and not necessarily of having cash or liquidity. If we examine the wealthiest people today, the vast majority are paper billionaires, in which they have amassed an extraordinary amount of shares in various companies and a high line of credit. And ownership of their shares attracts more investment and the ability to utilize their credit to take on large, substantial loans. However, according to Adam Smith, this creates a wealth disparity because the profits in shares of stocks are inherently inverse to the salary of workers. So we have this dichotomy of a few people or investors or companies with vast amounts of profits from shares of stock versus the actual workers of the companies whose salaries are not nearly equal as those profits, and in fact exponentially lower. So obviously this system has its roots in serfdom in the 16th centuries and before, where landowners amassed great wealth, whilst the workers on the field were mainly in debt and working to survive. So one way to close the gap on this wealth disparity is by implementing a system of a resource-based economy, so that not only are we protecting the environment from surplus waste, we can ensure that no one in local populations are living in poverty. So here is a quote by Chris Rock, which I think is quite relevant to our society today, is wealth is not about having a lot of money. It's about having a lot of options. And I think this is quite true in our society today. It has been proposed by sociologists that poverty is actually a learned behavior. So when we focus on money instead of opportunity, we are supporting wealth inequality in an indirect way. Having wealth in our society today is the ability to attract investment and resources from a diverse group of organizations, and always having options to back away if it's not something that aligns with our values. So in summary, implementing a system that combines a resource-based economy with a local monetary system will work together to close the gap on wealth inequality, because people will begin investing in things that they care about instead of keeping money that they will never use. So this also potentially prevents one percenters and corporations from hoarding cash, which causes either a deflation or hyperinflation in the economy. And although Switzerland came out positively from the recent deflation, it was mainly because the government spent a lot of capital investing in companies, small businesses, and in particular social programs at the local level, which offset the negative aspects of deflation and hyperinflation. So in austerity, did not work in the UK during the Thatcher and Blair eras. But in fact, austerity created more wealth disparity as a result because corporations began hoarding cash in multiple tax havens whilst the population suffered without any social programs to help them. Now, Switzerland, if we examine a nation like Switzerland, in which each canton determines their own rate of tax, they are more effective in addressing the needs of the local population because there isn't a single mandate as in the UK or the United States or in Russia, in which there is a single rate that applies to all, simply because most corporations will attempt to bypass that rate and hoard cash in tax havens. And that is just simply the nature of the beast. Switzerland, I want to add, was also the first to respond and allow small businesses to rapidly access loans guaranteed by the government during the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, which the UK recently copied in their bounce back loan strategy. So in ideology, a resource-based economy seems completely at odds with the local system of central banking. However, I think sometimes marriages between people who are vastly different are ultimately more successful because they possess opposite strengths in the same philosophy, in the same philosophy of the yin and the yang in Taoism. So adopting this bilateral system could act as a checks and balances in and of itself. And although unconventional, a resource-based economy will ensure that the needs of the local population are met so that no one is suffering to pay the bills or afford food or childcare or any other essential service, while at the same time, it will allow businesses to flourish without the strain put on financial institutions to meet federal regulations, but allow each state to make fiscal policy that is specific to their local population. And this goes back to what happened in my examples of Tenino in Washington state, circulating their own currency made of wood. Keeping business within its local borders, it shields the population from the effects of hyperinflation. And this doesn't necessarily mean, back to the dollar, that we have to replace the US dollar as a reserve currency. It simply means that we are shifting the value of our communities as collateral instead of a currency. So another potential positive about marrying these seemingly vastly different ideologies is that people would develop more trust in central banking solutions. And currently right now, it is at an all-time low, similar to the sentiment of the people during the Great Depression. And I think there is a great future for blockchain-based exchanges. However, we must remember that we can't simply replace an existing system with another similar system, a decentralized one. 2008 was a warning for all of us to develop an alternate system which doesn't simply mirror existing financial institutions, such as predatory lending practices, irresponsible derivatives trading, credit default swaps, commingling of funds, and lack of transparency and focus on short-term profit. Ideally, blockchain was built to be fully transparent, but when second-layer solutions work to override that transparency, then what we have is a system that is the same as the one we have just replaced. But in the future of blockchain-based exchanges, I think there can work as an innovative lobbying and fundraising tools, a digital clearinghouse of stakeholders, and add value to community that is based on long-term profit. So our challenges for the Great Reset are the following. How, as a consumer, can we make choices that benefit our local populations? How can we support our local businesses and the creative industries? And how can we eradicate debt and poverty in our local communities? How can we utilize our society of abundance so that people no longer have to work just to survive? And how could we make our industries protect our environment? And what can we do as individuals to focus on our well-being? And I believe these are themes every investor and founders of companies should focus on to capitalize on our era of abundance and to close the gap on wealth inequality, and to refocus on implementing a resource-based economy rather than one based on GDP. So, and these are my references.
Okay, thank you so much, Sierra. We can now continue with the Q&A session. So thank you very much for such a great keynote with a great impact, social impact and economic impact concerned. And you actually addressed a lot of questions in terms of diversity and equality of resources, access to resources for different layers of population. And what do you think about this power of corporations and their influence on the local policies as well in terms of creating the rules? Can individual states actually sustain the global power of corporations, and at times they are in private hands as well, so that we have this small and medium enterprises emerging, which are the sources of diversity and innovation pop up and also have their own place in this power game? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that is a fantastic question. So I'm so glad that you asked such an important and interesting question. And the power of the corporations is definitely quite important, but we have to remember that not all corporations have a negative mindset, and that it's just simply the nature of the beast that they are profit motivated. But I think many corporations and many leaders of corporations have a responsibility that they want to help our population decrease wealth inequality, but they don't quite know how to go about it. And so I think this will be very individual to each local state, to the local government especially, so that if corporations were able to work directly with local governments as opposed to on a federal level, I think they will be much more effective in making immediate impact in their local communities, because government is most effective at a local level and it becomes less ineffective at the federal and the national levels.
Yeah, I think it's good for transparent governments, which are not that much corrupted, because we have different types of states, developed markets, emerging markets, and different regulations and transparency in each of them. And you also mentioned a lot about blockchain solutions, also for government purposes, to be more transparent for the population, because global corporations, they also rely on the resource of global population to win their hearts with their products. And actually, these institutions can be a mediator between people being the source and people being stakeholders, and having more of power in terms of participating actually and have access to democratizing financial markets as well. What would you say on that? Which emerging opportunities we could create as a community of serial entrepreneurs and VC investors to give more power to emerging small, medium enterprises and innovation-driven bottom-up, mostly from emerging startups, and giving power to people?
Absolutely, and I think that's also a great observation that you made as well, is that blockchain and exchanges like LATOKEN have this great power currently, where we're at this great reset, to be able to utilize the blockchain in order to make small businesses, startups, and small medium enterprises more transparent, so that they will be able to work together with the local governments in order to launch projects that benefit the entire community. And blockchain, as I mentioned before, is a wonderful technology in which you can track the lines of production from one state to another, to one city to the next. And so you can track that online. And so I think that gives complete transparency and visibility to be able to sort of launch these kind of innovative projects across different borders as well.
Financial markets are also regulated, and at times we have also regulations popping up from global corporations, for instance, innovations such as Libra, and they are setting up precedent which can be multiplied later on. So setting up the rules which will be caught up by further on regulatory agreements between different states and so on. So here corporations also have power how to set up precedents and influence regulations. Is what should be the mechanism to regulate this corporation, local governments, and population democratization of financial markets, how this machine should work to keep up with the spirit of resource-based economy, which you addressed in your keynote.
Well, in my opinion, I think states should set up their own fiscal policy that is separate from, sort of a one fiscal mandate across many nations. As I've mentioned before, we want to absolutely avoid having one currency that dominates or one stablecoin that dominates the entire economy, because when that happens, wealth inequality increases, it exponentially increases. And so I think the solution would be for each state to create their own currency. To come up with their own fiscal policy that is catered to their particular local, to the local population. And obviously, we need to have some standards of behavior that applies to all, fiscal policy that applies to all. But I think the more intricate fiscal policy should be set up by local governments with their own currency, and not have one currency sort of dominate the entire global economy. Because that is like the last thing, because when that happens, as we've seen with the euro, is that many countries suffer while only a few benefit. And that is something that we want to avoid, is this wealth inequality.
And in terms of innovation by itself, so usually we have, corporations have enough resources to develop their own innovations and have their small captive funds, captive innovation hubs, accelerators to source innovations for their own needs for this global expansion and what we have now as the basic paradigm for expansion as a target to make more of unicorns, in planes and so on, and to increase the capitalization. So it's a bit of a power game as well. And how to support these smaller enterprises also to emerge and to play their individual and maybe independent role for diversity of these opportunities, and for people to be able to participate as stakeholders in these opportunities.
Yes, and this is actually quite a complex question, because that is exactly the paradigm that we live in today, as you mentioned, is that the corporation determines policies, governmental policies, in their sort of expansion to develop more unicorns, and they have a profit-based motive. So this is something that I think has a lot of complexity in the way we can approach this issue. Is that on a very elementary level, right now the corporation is equal to the role of the church in the medieval era. And so, mainly they have this power because they have lobbying capital to lobby for certain fiscal policies. And there's also a commingling of members of the corporation also working for the government, and vice versa. And so there is this sort of intermarriage between the two that we have right now. And right now, it would be incredibly complex to be able to separate those two powers without sort of a shock to the entire global economy. And so I think we need to do it in steps. I think the best way is to work with corporations, to work with the government in order to create small, lasting changes on the local level, which will immediately impact sort of more state level, and then perhaps on the national level. If we want to make changes, the best changes that we can make is most effective on the local scale. And so when we make changes on the local scale, then other localities also follow. And so this is sort of the pattern that we want to create, is sort of an inter-network of local communities that are working together for a particular end. But to sort of, tame the Leviathan right now as it is because the corporation is intermarried with the government, it would be incredibly hard to separate the two powers, because currently they are working as one.
Thank you so much. So that's all from my questions and our audiences. So I would like you maybe to address serial entrepreneurs and venture investors we have. So maybe some of your recommendations, how to survive, sustain in the new reality, how to support these emerging opportunities which are actually more harmonious for the whole ecosystem, which we have not only in finance, but also in economics, in ecology, as you mentioned also, and just to save the planet, to add to the diversity of population and access to resources, to move actually to this resource-based economy and support different parts of the world without this access abundance, which is not actually efficiently used by the global population. So what would be your key address? Maybe some opportunities which serial entrepreneurs and can engage in. And you mentioned a number of trends, actually, such as technologies supporting remote work, creativity, individual creativity, which can be promoted by creating of individual global brands and different types of passion industry development, as you mentioned. So what would be the hotspots to keep in focus to support this whole this whole movement?
So I think right now we're at a very extraordinary time of change. And as you've mentioned, during times of change, there are great opportunities that we could focus on. And so I think as far as I'm concerned, I think sectors that I think will become more prominent within the next 20 years are nanofactories, AR, telemedicine, personalized medicine, quantum computing, and of course, obviously, the influx of the passion industry and all the entrepreneurs who are working to sort of work in doing various different sectors. And so I think right now could be a time for great optimism, in that if we examine all the opportunities available for us that weren't available before, that we will find new ways of launching businesses that will be quite different from the fourth industrial revolution as we saw. But now that we're entering the fifth industrial revolution, now is the time to experiment and connect and use our resources, our networks, to be able to draw investment to our projects that will have a benefit not only towards a profit-based motive, but for the benefit of the community on the local level. And I think that is key, is that if we focus on making our local communities better, then this sort of philosophy will catch on to the rest of the communities as well.
And the last question emerging now. So in terms of access to big data, because most of the trends you mentioned, if we take the corporation plan, and it's also based on gathering lots of huge amounts of big data across the world. How to avoid manipulation and use of this big data by the governments also and by the corporations to their own needs. Also to support this emerging smaller players not to be manipulated, as well as the population.
Right. So I've mentioned in the beginning of my talk about Søren Kierkegaard's hypervigilant society. And so the use of big data is something we cannot avoid in our society today. I mean, despite the fact that we have this sort of pessimistic look at big data, there actually could be a lot of good done from big data. For example, Facebook is facial recognition technology is able to sort of capture criminals through CCTV videos by matching up the face. And so that is something that wasn't available 100 years ago or 200 years ago. When people committed a crime, usually there was no justice. But now that because we live in this hypervigilant society, it doesn't have to be this all-encompassing, sort of negative outlook that we have to have. We can use it to our own we can use it to become sort of the checks and balances for the corporation itself, so that our data isn't exploited, but utilized in a way that benefits the population, as in the instance of being able to sort of track criminals across, various different nations, and be able to, for the community to quickly act when something happens. And so I think the nature of big data, there's always the pros and the cons. And I think if we focus on making sure that we become the checks and balances to corporations, then as long as we're aware that those exploits are being happened, then we can prevent them from happening as well.
Yeah, and I also think that social impact is also an important check mark, which should be in the focus of attention of investors when they support different types of early stage innovations. And we also have this industry developing as impact investments, which are generating profits as well as serving the whole society. So that's all on my part. If you'd like to say just a key message of yours as an address to our key audiences, which are serial entrepreneurs and VC investors, please just do so. Thank you.
Right. So first of all, I want to thank you, Nadia, for moderating this event, and also to all the members of LATOKEN, Elena and Valentina and Dimitri as well, for putting on these series of economic talks that have been so incredibly fascinating and so important in our world today. And so I think that, the themes that every investor and founders of companies should focus on is what I mentioned before, is to capitalize on our era of abundance and to close the gap on wealth inequality, and to refocus on implementing a resource-based economy rather than one based on GDP.
Thank you so much. And we also welcome you to join our different types of events. You're also a recurrent panelist on our roadshows, pitch competitions, and with the Keynote as well. So I welcome you also to Startup Leaders Club, where we have discussions with early stage startups, which could get advice, insights from each other from different fields, backgrounds, facing any challenges and trying to grasp new opportunities. So it's brainstorming sessions which help them to overcome crisis and to build new policies maybe for their own businesses. And thank you so much, and we wish you good luck. Wish you a nice weekend. All the best. Thank you, Sierra.